About 3 months ago, my wife Monica and I, along with our 12-year-old daughter Sadie, moved into a cabin in northern Maine. Monica had dreamed of living in a cabin even before we got married, and as I had just landed a lucrative position at an IT company that allowed me to work from just about anywhere, we figured that was as good a time as any to make the move. To say the cabin was in a remote location was an understatement. There were at least 2 miles between us and our nearest neighbor, and the closest town was at least 10 miles away, if not more. While I initially wasn't keen on moving out into the middle of nowhere, I adjusted surprisingly well to the change. I enjoyed the tranquility of the woods around us, and not having to constantly deal with the all-too fast-paced city living we never grew accustomed to in the 6 years we lived in New York. It was a 3-bedroom cabin right next to a lake, and it had a name: Hilltop Hollow. It was one of those places that appeared more spacious from the inside than the outside. When you walked in, there was a large living room on the left, a kitchen on the right, and a hallway straight ahead that led all the way to the master bedroom. My office was on the right side of the hall, and Sadie's bedroom was at the end of a shorter hallway that branched off to the left as you entered the main hallway, so it was difficult to see her door unless you were standing directly in front of it. There were a few odd things about the place we noticed shortly after moving in. For example, Sadie's bedroom door lock was on the outside of the door. Sadie joked that I should cut a bean hole in the door to serve her meals in her cell. Also, there were small but noticeable fluctuations in temperature as you moved throughout the cabin with no discernible cause or reason for them. I suppose that would have raised a red flag for some folks, but I just convinced myself that there had to be some rational explanation that I simply wasn't grasping, and after a while, we all just grew accustomed to it. When I wasn't working, I spent most of my time on the lake, fishing. Monica homeschooled Sadie, and although the cabin's isolated location made it difficult for Sadie to make new friends, Monica went into town regularly, and being the outgoing person she is, she quickly made friends with other moms with daughters, allowing Sadie a few opportunities to interact with kids her own age. About a month after we had moved in, Sadie started sleepwalking. At first, she would do this maybe once or twice a week, but after some time, it became a nightly routine. Monica was a light sleeper, so she would wake up to hear our daughter's footsteps on the creaking floorboards as she made her way toward our bedroom every night. Sadie would stand at the foot of our bed, swaying from side to side with her hair in front of her face, and mumbling. When all of this started, I would sleep right through these episodes. But after the first 5 times or so it happened, I too would awake to hear my daughter mumbling at the foot of the bed. The first time I witnessed it, I have to say, it freaked me out, but only because sleepwalking always disturbed me. Both the thought of seeing it and being the one doing it, just that notion of potentially waking up in a place I didn't recognize and not knowing how I got there. If you know anything about sleepwalking, you know that waking up a sleepwalker is one of the worst things you can do, mainly because it scares the bejesus out of them, and there's a good chance they'll go into fight or flight mode. So each time Monica woke up to see Sadie standing, swaying, and mumbling at the foot of our bed, she would get up from her side of the bed to gently guide my daughter back to her room. But each time she started to get up from the bed, our daughter would just turn around and head back toward her room on her own. So we'd wait for her to turn the corner, then we'd go back to bed. Around the same time the sleepwalking episode started, Sadie started to look noticeably tired during the day. She even passively mentioned that she had been suffering from nightmares, but would refuse to discuss what they were about. This didn't surprise me, though. Like me, she isn't exactly an open book. My wife would often remind me that she and I were exactly alike in that regard. In fact, she hadn't woken up screaming from a nightmare or asked to sleep in our bed since she was 4 years old. She was and still is a tough kid that plays things pretty close to the chest. After a while, Monica became concerned about the episodes, and her anxiety kicked into high gear when she awoke one morning and found her plants dumped from their pots and the soil in them placed in strange geometrical patterns on the front porch. Sadie insisted she had nothing to do with it, and the front door had been locked the night before. Honestly, we didn't know what the hell to make of it. I mean, can someone in such a reduced state of consciousness unlock a door? Maybe. But it seemed strange. Also, it seemed unlikely that someone else was responsible. The mud was thick around the front of the cabin, and there were no footprints or tire marks to indicate anyone had been there. It wasn't an animal either. These were definitive organized shapes and patterns, and I had the feeling they were created with some intention in mind, although I didn't have a clue as to what that intention was. We finally settled on the idea that Sadie had somehow unlocked the door and committed the act, however unlikely it seemed. But that being the case, it raised a more immediate concern, which was Sadie's safety. Naturally, we were worried about her wandering outside and getting lost in the woods, or possibly stepping off the pier into the lake and drowning. I didn't want to lock her in her own room at night in case she needed to use the bathroom. Plus, it struck me as a cruel and unnecessary thing to do. I decided to order and install a double-sided keypad door lock, which would allow us to lock the front door from the inside and outside using a code which only Monica and I knew. Meanwhile, Monica attempted to set up an appointment for Sadie to see a doctor in town so that we could find out why these episodes were occurring so frequently. But when she called, the office receptionist informed her that the doctor was out of town and wouldn't return for another week. And so we waited. And night after night, it was the same routine. Sadie would end up at the foot of our bed, swaying, mumbling, with her hair in her face. Then she would turn around, walk back toward her room, and out of sight. And the more time that went on, the more uneasy I felt. Sadie's presence in our bedroom began to feel more threatening. And then I felt guilty for feeling that way about my own daughter, especially when Monica mentioned that the episodes could be some manifestation of anxiety or stress about the move. I tried to convince myself that this would all come to an end. The sleepwalking episodes and my own increasing dread about the situation. At that point, we were all losing sleep and clearly stressed out about it. One evening, as she stood in front of our bed, I could make out what she was mumbling. She was saying, "Ashamed to hurt such a pretty girl. Such a pretty. After she had gone back to bed, I got up later to check on her. She was whimpering, tossing, turning, sweating. I gently woke her and she shot straight up in her bed, crying hysterically. "Were you having a bad dream, sweetie? You're okay now, you're okay," I said as I cradled her, attempting to offer some measure of comfort. When she had settled down, I asked her if she wanted to talk about her nightmare. She refused and went back to bed, and eventually I did also. I awoke the next morning before Monica and headed for the kitchen to make a pot of coffee. But I stopped dead in my tracks as I glanced straight ahead of me. Sadie was in the kitchen. She was swaying but not mumbling, and her hair wasn't completely obstructing her face this time. Her face was expressionless. Her eyes widened as she looked at me and with a neutral tone said,
"I could have killed her, you know."
And before I could register her words, I heard a blood-curdling scream from my daughter's bedroom. I turned and raced toward her bedroom door and saw that her door had been locked from the outside. Without thinking, I unlocked the door and stormed inside. Sadie was curled up in a fetal position on the floor. Her bed sheets had been ripped up and pieces had been used to bind her hands and feet. And she was coughing and crying. A piece of cloth hung from her neck and a rolled pair of her socks lay beside her, covered in saliva. The cloth and socks were used as a gag that she had managed to get loose and spit out. I can't describe the feeling of utter terror and confusion that gripped me in that moment. I ran to her, and as I pulled her up, I noticed bruises in the shape of fingers around her neck. And it was then that my fear turned into pure rage. I jumped up and ran out of the room and toward the kitchen, but she, or it, wasn't there. And the front door was locked. We didn't need to think about what to do next. It was crystal clear. We packed what we could fit in the car and left as quickly as we could that same morning. As we got in the car, Sadie told me about her nightmares. She dreamt about seeing a girl who looked exactly like her, and this girl would stand at the foot of her bed every night, and she kept calling her pretty and told Sadie she would hurt her if she stayed. Apparently, that last night we stayed in the cabin, she made good on that threat. As I hit the gas and we peeled off down the dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time in my rearview mirror, and I saw this thing, which now appeared as a clone of Monica, about 100 yards behind us, chasing us and screaming. I decided then and there to never mention what I saw to Monica and Sadie. It was absolutely terrifying, and I didn't want to add to the intense fear they were already experiencing. It's been 1 week since we left Hilltop Hollow. We've been staying with my brother and his family in Boston until we figure out what to do next. Sadie's sleepwalking episodes stopped, but the nightmares continue. Monica has been clearly traumatized by the whole incident, just silent and withdrawn. I've never seen her this way. She'll often get up in the middle of the night to check on Sadie. I don't blame her. Last night, the sheriff of the town near Hilltop Hollow called me. He said he was sorry for calling at such a late hour, then informed me that a hiker had discovered a mutilated corpse about 2 miles from our cabin. His working theory was that whoever this person was had accidentally fallen into a steep ditch, injured one or both of their legs, and were attacked and eaten by a black bear. He added that identifying the body might take some time, but he was pretty sure it was a female. He described scraps of a blue coat found at the scene and asked if I or anyone in my family had seen anyone fitting that description around or near our cabin before we left. I hesitated, then told him we hadn't. When I hung up the phone, I felt a little guilty, wondering if I should have mentioned something about our experience at the cabin. Maybe that thing was somehow responsible, but honestly, what would I have said? That some shape-shifting doppelganger ghost had threatened and attacked my daughter? Earlier, I was lying in bed thinking about the blue jacket the sheriff mentioned. And I remembered something. Monica had worn a blue parka that day. Maybe, I thought to myself, maybe it was that thing they had found. Maybe it wasn't a ghost entirely and it had entered into some corporeal state and was killed. That thought became a hope, and one that relieved me immensely. I kissed Monica, who had shut her eyes hours ago, and I turned out the light. After a few minutes, when I was just drifting off to sleep, I heard Monica whisper something in the dark. Now it's nearly dawn and I haven't slept a wink. I can't shake this horrifying suspicion I now have. I'm thinking about who I actually may have seen in the rearview mirror that day. I'm thinking about another possible explanation for Monica's strange behavior. I'm thinking about who they found in that ditch, and I'm also thinking about what the hell I'm going to do next, if I'm right. All of this, because of the words Monica said that made my blood run cold. When she whispered,
"She really is such a pretty."